under Ronald Reagan, but he had done his doctoral thesis on the need for a continental water policy. Now, one of the things that I always used to tell my students, and I tell everybody now about, is that if you want to know what a person is going to focus their life on, read what they write when they're young. Most of them are telling you what they plan to do. All the question is whether they can get in a position to implement it. The classic example, of course, in history is that if you'd read Mein Kampf when it was originally published, you knew exactly what Hitler planned to do. But what did we do? We banned the book. It's an absolutely classic example of why nothing should be banned. Everything should be out there, and people should go and read what these people are saying when they're young. I mean, in Canada, for example, we had a Prime Minister, Trudeau, who was editing a journal called Cité Libre, telling Canadians what he planned to do if he ever got to be Prime Minister of Canada, and by golly, he did it. In his doctoral thesis, Yoder wrote about this need for a continental water policy. He got into the position to be able to negotiate the free trade, and of course saw this as an opportunity to implement a continental water policy. As we've already mentioned, there was already 80% free trade between Canada and the U.S. In fact, Kim, what was interesting was there was more free trade between Canada and the U.S., and there still is today, despite NAFTA, than there is between the Canadian provinces. There are great restrictions on trade within Canada, much greater than they are between Canada and the U.S.
And I want you to define free trade. What does it really mean?
It's rarely free. There's always some restrictions, and of course, theoretically what it is that there really is no border. There are no restrictions on trade across a border. This was the problems that they had with the European community. They brought in the free trade within the community, but then de Gaulle, who didn't like it, immediately set up all kinds of health and other restrictions. He brought in over 400 pieces of legislation of saying, for example, Danish butter, and the French farmers didn't want Danish butter coming in and competing with them, and so they said, oh, well, Danish butter's got to sit at the border for a year before we can allow it in. Oh, and sorry, we got no refrigeration to protect it. So there's many ways to skin the cat.
By the way, you know there's thousands of free trade zones around America,
yes.
And what they're being used for is to bring in people and groups from outside the United States of America and give them free access to do whatever they want to do, basically. No restrictions.
Well, this is the difficulty. How do you have freedom in one area of your relationship between nations and not allow freedom within others? I mean, one of the problems the European community is now experiencing is the freedom of movement and, the inundation of people from Eastern Europe looking for better economic opportunities. It sounds very nice and idealistic, but the realities are much, much more difficult to deal with. When you get into a free trade agreement, you have to consider what potential things you're going to sacrifice in order to get access to a resource or something that you need.
Now, you said to me when we were talking yesterday, I took some notes, but you said, NAFTA is about water. And I never, ever thought about NAFTA as being about water resources. Why are you so sure about it?
Let's start out by saying that there is no water shortage. A lot of it is being artificially created or is created because of misuse of water or people wanting to live in areas where there isn't adequate water and demanding that it be provided to them as a human right. But inequitable distribution is one of the great problems. And in North America, Canada has about 1/3 of the world's fresh water. In the United States, you can draw a line down the middle of the continent, and apart from the Northwest, the Oregon region, apart from that small area, a line down the middle separates less than 20 inches of rainfall to the west of the line and more than 20 inches to the east of the line. And by the way, that's a very important boundary line because it also separates completely different soil types, because the rain creates the soil types and vegetation that can grow. And one of the things that I've always talked about with the U.S. was when Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man," he didn't take into account that there wasn't any water out in the west. And of course, the people with the wagon trains going west, going through the deserts and surviving that horrible trek, and they went west, and of course they get to California, supposed to be the land of milk and honey, but it didn't have the water supply. And what's been going on since then is trying to get adequate water supply into Western North America. One of the ways that this can be done, of course, is by massive diversion schemes of water from Canada south. Prior to NAFTA, there were huge schemes. I mentioned one, the Grand Canal scheme of water from James Bay. There was another scheme that was being promoted called the Cooper Project, which was designed to divert water from Manitoba, the Great Lakes in Manitoba, in the center of the continent, down through the Red River system into the American Midwest. And that, by the way, was promoted by a former premier of the province of Manitoba by the name of Gary Filmon, and he did his master's thesis on that proposal as an engineer. But the largest continental scheme prior to NAFTA, and is still on the books, was something called NWAPA, which is the North American Water and Power Alliance. And this was a scheme that was promoted by a Senator Moss of Utah, Frank Moss. It was designed to take water from the Yukon River and divert it south through the Rocky Mountain Trench, which would create a huge lake in British Columbia that would be about 700 miles long by 40 miles wide. That water would then be pumped into the Columbia River, I should say, and then into the Snake, and then into the Colorado, and down into California. And of course, Moss was arguing that without that kind of water, the western United States simply couldn't develop properly. The NWAPA plan, by the way, the engineering on it was done by the Parsons Company out of Los Angeles.
Pasadena, yeah. Could we then say that the western United States doesn't have its own water?
It's a water deficit region. More water is taken up by plants or evaporation to space than is falling in rainfall on an annual basis. And so it is a water deficit region. The Ogallala Aquifer that I talked about that runs down the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains was created again during the last ice age, and it runs right down into Texas, by the way. It is recharged, but it's recharged from the wet eastern side, not from a runoff from the Rocky Mountains. The southwest corner of the continent, from the line down the middle of the U.S. and from the Canadian border south, is essentially a water deficit region. Now, one of the ways we see that in history, by the way, and this is where my climate and historical research comes in, is that whenever there is a drought, the 1930s drought, for example, the greatest impact was in Southern California and into Oklahoma and right through there, and you're seeing a bit of that now with the Texas drought. When you go back in history, for example, the great civilizations of the Southwest, the Hopi Indians, the Navajo, the Four Borders region, the rainfall was adequate for their corn crops and so on. Then it started to get dry. They started to do irrigation. And then it got so dry that the whole civilizations collapsed. The same thing was happening with the Maya in South America at the same time. Those people migrated out of there, and it's a very interesting thing because amongst people of northern Canada, the Dene people, there are a lot of Hopi and Navajo Indian words in their language that were transported by the people migrating at that time. The region is generally a deficit region that goes through periodic droughts. Now, every region goes through drought, but because it's already dry to start with, it becomes a bigger problem.
Okay, and I also want to ask you something. It seems to me now that just because there's an aquifer in a certain region doesn't mean that that region will have access to it. Is that correct?
Yes, it depends on the depth of the aquifer and of course, your ability to extract the water. In fact, groundwater is the biggest source of water for people around the world through wells. And of course, where groundwater comes to the surface, we see it in the form of a lake or a river. The amount of water you can take out of an aquifer is limited by the rate at which it is recharged. Now, we talked earlier about the aquifers under the Sahara Desert. One of the largest in the Western Sahara, where Libya is, it covers 700,000 square kilometers. But it's recharged from the Nile River and from the Tibesti mountain ranges and so on. The water flows through the rock, a recharge rate of 2 inches a year. So if you take more than 2 inches out, the recharge rate, it doesn't replace it.
When you say recharge rate, I want you to explain that a little bit more clearly.
Okay, if you imagine that you have a well drilled into an aquifer, you can pump water out of that